Thank you. As I walked in after Ken's speech, everybody else was walking out. I'm glad to see a lot of you have either walked back or come back for the first time. I need to make one correction from yesterday's presentation when I said that the Cambridge spies went to Oxford. They didn't. They went to Cambridge, of course. As a graduate of the London School of Economics, I'm completely agnostic as to whether it's Oxford or Cambridge. They're both strange places for me. But anyway, today we continue the series on industrial espionage. Yesterday I talked about everything except industrial. And just by way of introduction to it, I have a thingy somewhere. Well, maybe it doesn't matter. Industrial espionage, of course, is rife today. There is large amounts of it being done. Normally by the citizens of foreign countries within America, living within America, or living in Europe. And they get up to all sorts of tricks, mainly for money. This young lady, Joya Williams, in 2006, was the assistant to the marketing director of Coca-Cola. She decided that the plans for a new product launch, together with a sample, would be of interest to Pepsi-Cola. So she contacted them under an assumed name, Bob or something innocuous, and said she had something they might be interested in. What she didn't realize was that Pepsi-Cola is an extraordinarily ethical company, as indeed is Coca-Cola. And the first thing they did was to alert the police, and the FBI set up a sting. They met her, they took a copy of the sample, they interviewed her, they agreed to pay her a certain amount of money, and then of course they arrested her. She got 8 years for her efforts. Similarly, Boeing, I think just about every major American corporation has at one time or another been the subject of an industrial espionage attack. Boeing in 2005, there was a man called Dongfeng Chung who decided that he had a grievance against the company because they wanted to move him to a new location where he didn't want to go. So they let him leave the company. He wasn't terribly pleased with the whole event, so he decided he would sell the plans that he'd collected over the years. He met an intermediary, and it was actually the intermediary who was caught, and it was when his house was investigated that they found reference to Mr. Chung. So they raided his house and they found 30,000 odd documents, a lot of them relating to the Columbia shuttle, and arrested him, and for his pains he got 15 years. A little bit less obvious as a spying activity, but just as dangerous, Jose Ignacio Lopez was the former head of production at Opel in Europe. He was a Spaniard. And he decided that Opel had breached a number of promises that they made him, one of which was to set up a production plant in Spain, which they eventually decided that they weren't going to do. So he left and he joined Volkswagen. Absolutely no problem in doing that, except that he took a whole suitcase of documents and plans with him, a lot of which related to a rather clever purchasing system that he'd set up for Volkswagen. And he introduced it for General Motors, which he introduced into Volkswagen. And not surprisingly, General Motors got a little bit miffed at all this when they found out what was going on. Volkswagen were equally upset, and they paid General Motors 100 million, and agreed to buy car parts from the company in restitution. He was found guilty in 1998 of the charges against him, but they were eventually dropped. The criminal charges were dropped. He now lives in retirement in Spain and does a certain amount of charity work for his pains. He never went to jail. Even a little bit stranger, I mean, people moving between companies is perfectly normal, and you take your secrets with you. You just have to be careful that you don't take what is called a trade secret with you. And a trade secret is defined very carefully in an act which the Americans put in place in the early 2000s called the Economic Espionage Act. And that says that for a secret to be classified as a trade secret, it first of all has to be one. I mean, it has to be of importance to the company. It has to have a certain amount of stature to it to qualify. It also actually has to be labeled as a trade secret. The documents that refer to it all have to have trade secret typed on them. And the company has to take reasonable precautions to protect the trade secret. So if you leave a set of plans on a desk in Starbucks and somebody else picks them up from a competitor, that is deemed to be in breach of your duty of care to the trade secret, and it would not be thus classified in any action that took place afterwards. The action between Procter & Gamble and Unilever was a little bit more worrying in the sense that it was disguised, or it was actually set up by Procter & Gamble as a competitive intelligence activity. As I mentioned to you yesterday, competitive intelligence is something that takes place all the time. Most major companies use it because they need to track what their competitors are doing. And Procter & Gamble is a big user of competitive intelligence. Their former President John Pepper, or rather CEO John Pepper, is a great advocate of it and still speaks on the subject. And so the Competitive Intelligence Department set up something to look at Unilever's launch of a new product. It's a hair care product. And this was perfectly okay, perfectly legitimate. The company that was selected to do it was a bona fide competitive intelligence agency, adhering to ethical and legal standards that would mean that they didn't do anything underhand. But unfortunately, they subcontracted part of the exercise to a third party. And the third party was definitely, I don't actually know who they are, but they were definitely unethical. And what they did, and so the story goes, is that they managed to bribe some of the security people that worked in the Unilever offices to go around the desks at night and pick up any documents that looked interesting in relating to hair care products. Unfortunately, the security people weren't that bright, and they certainly weren't that discriminating, so they hoovered up a whole load of documents covering just about every product that Unilever was developing at the time, and delivered them to the agency working for Procter & Gamble. They had a data entry system which put it all in, and eventually it was spotted that the amount of information being collected was just way beyond the terms of reference of the project. And in this instance, they realized something had gone drastically wrong. And so Procter & Gamble reported themselves to Unilever. They actually, the two, Pepper contacted the head of Unilever and said, look, we've been doing some work and something's gone wrong and we've got all this information. I guarantee we'll destroy it. They paid them $10 million, which is, in the big scheme of things, not that much money, and agreed to an independent audit to make sure that everything else they did complied with legal and ethical standards. The whole of the Competitive Intelligence Department, many of whom I knew quite well, were let go as a result of this episode. It wasn't actually their fault, to be perfectly honest. They could only be accused of not looking deep enough into what was being done on their behalf, but they certainly didn't condone the activity. But that gives you the flavor of what goes on. There's a big mix of the stupid, the avaricious, and the intelligent, but always willing to push the boundaries of people out there who will sell or give information to companies about their own employers' plans. And if you want a bit of fun one day, go onto a website, I think it's one of the American justice websites, that carries a list of all of these prosecutions under the Economic Espionage Act. And some of them are hilarious. I mean, they're just, you think, how could anybody be that stupid? But well, there's plenty of them out there. That's what happens today. Most of my talk is about what happened yesterday. And these next 5 lectures, this one and the next 4 lectures, are about discrete episodes of espionage activity, for the most part, which have had a quite earth-shattering experience on the industries to which they relate. every industry that's developed has had some contribution of espionage to its formation and evolution. I think it'd be hard to imagine that it hasn't gone on throughout history in just about every industry. The reason I've picked silk is because it's the first recorded case where espionage led to the development of the industry. Silk, just a few words about it and what it is and how it develops, because it's impossible to understand the espionage aspect unless you know a little bit about it. Silk is reputed to have been produced in China from 2500 to 3000 BC. And they attribute the origins of it to the period of Empress Si Ling, 2600 BC. And she was known as the goddess of the silkworm. It's not a reference I would relish myself, but that's what they called her. The story is that a young princess was having a cup of tea in her garden one day when a silkworm fell off the branches of the tree and into the cup. The cup contained a hot liquid, and the cocoon that dropped into her tea entangled itself, and the silk strands were found floating in the tea, and somebody worked out eventually that you could combine these strands into a filament of silk. Maybe an unlikely story, but as good as anything else that can explain the origins of a lot of these things. I mean, how do we end up eating potatoes, for God's sake? Who took the first bite? There are examples of quite exotic silks going back into history. 4th century BC, this is a silk gauze that was produced. The virtue of silk is that it is strong, it has elasticity, and extremely long fibers. And it's said that a 7-filament strand of silk can take 65,000 pounds per square inch, which is a hell of a lot stronger than the wool in my pullover. The silk, if you know anything about the industry, this will be boring to you, but actually silk is coming from, oddly enough, the silkworm. The larvae of the silkworm feeds off mulberry bushes and lays an egg. The egg is then, inside it is the cocoon, which weaves the fabric of the silk around itself to protect itself. And it is that fabric within the cocoon that creates the silk. What the Chinese discovered is that if they heated the cocoon before the larvae turned into the next stage of its development, the silk would actually be released. And if you put it in hot water, it would all come out. And you could then use the strands to weave a silk material. Sorry, a silk strand, a silk filament, which then you could weave into material. I'm hanging onto this podium for grim death because if I don't, you'll think I've joined the dancers that were here last night. So there's a particular type of mulberry bush that is appetizing to the silkworm, and without that particular type of mulberry bush, the silkworm won't produce the silk. And without that particular type of silkworm, you won't get the silk either. And you have to know the technology for extracting the silk from the cocoon and how to weave it into finished product. So there's three key stages in the process. First of all, you've got to grow the mulberry trees, which of course are native to China, but nowhere else in those days. Then you've got the sericulture element of it, which is the production and the dyeing of the silk, and then you've got the weaving of the silk fabrics. Without those three, of course, you haven't got a business. There are all sorts of examples of silk, just illustrating the durability of the material. 2nd century BC, this is a piece of silk which survives extraordinarily well with the pattern still in it. And what is interesting is that there is a strong correlation between silk and royalty. Silk is extremely attractive to anybody of wealth because of its characteristics, and the industry has grown very largely on the back of the nobility who've got the money to pay for it. So Chinese emperors were big benefactors of the silk business, and because they wanted the material for themselves. The process itself, just to illustrate it for you, I gave you a sort of thumbnail sketch, but you've got the silkworm, which creates the cocoon. The cocoon is then heated, either by steam or hot water, to release the fibers within it and kill the larvae. They have to kill the larvae as well. Then the fibers are threaded together. The silk fiber is threaded through an eyelet onto a wheel, just as you would with any other fabric, cotton or wool. And then that fabric is either single-stranded or multiple-stranded, depending on what type of fiber you ultimately want. There's a series of pictures which follow about it being done. These look distinctly Japanese to me, but of course it all took place originally in China. Washing the silkworm eggs, they make great efforts to only use very healthy silkworms. Exactly how you detect the health of a silkworm, I don't know. I don't think it's a medical, clinical process, but presumably there are some visual characterizations. You have to then feed them to fatten them up, collect the mulberry leaves in order to provide the food. They mash them up and lay them on trays for the silkworms to engorge themselves with it. And then they extract the silks from the cocoons. One cocoon, I was quite surprised with that figure, produces 1,000 to 2,000 feet of silk filament. And 1 yard of silk, a yard being how wide I don't know, requires 3,000 cocoons. So it's a mass production business. The thread is then spun, and it's spun into a continuous thread, and there's then a process called throwing, which is quite important because it is a process which crops up in this presentation later on, which is a twisting and doubling of the thread to make a more substantial yarn. All wound and then laid out to dry, dyed, and woven. And that's a historical representation of the draw loom to do the weaving. That's fairly complex weaving, and there's a modern one in a museum in China today, a reproduction of it. So the first thing that happened was that silk became, as I say, it was a royal material, and the Japanese were the first to steal it. They went into China, they sent a small mission into China, who managed to get some silkworms, some mulberry leaves, and they took some mulberry plants rather, and they took them back to Japan, and that was the origins of the Japanese silk industry. The Indians, the Indian subcontinent at the time was also very interested in silk because they knew about it, because the Chinese by this time had started exporting it. And one clever Indian prince decided that he would marry a Chinese princess. And he said to her, well, when you come to India, you know, we don't have an awful lot of silk in India, and I can tell that you like it an awful lot. So why don't you bring some silkworms and some whatever else we need to India when you come to marry me? She, being a gullible Chinese princess, no doubt, said, yeah, fine. So she hid all the stuff in her hair. Pretty disgusting sounding process to have silk larvae wandering around in your scalp. And the legend is that when she got to India, she handed over all the stuff she'd brought with her, and the prince said, actually, I don't want to marry you after all. And so she died a disappointed lady. As I said, the silk by this time was being traded quite extensively, and the Silk Road between China, and Byzantium was what is now, or what became Byzantium, opened up as a trade route, not only for silk, for quite a lot of other materials, and it was a two-way flow as well. It was a flow of products produced in China, which included silk and porcelain and whatever else. And then what came back was money and goods produced in the Middle East at the time. The Silk Road, as you can see, traverses the whole of Asia. It divides in the middle around the desert, but comes back together again and ends up in what is now the Middle East. The Romans were the first beneficiary of this trade. The Roman senators' wives were very keen to have silk clothes. Seneca writes about silk in his writings, and he describes noble Roman ladies wearing silk clothes, which by all accounts disguised absolutely nothing. I mean, they might not have been wearing anything at all from a visual point of view. Obviously they've changed a bit today, but this was the height of fashion in ancient Rome. I've missed out a theft in Japan somewhere, but let's not worry too much. Oh, I'm going backwards, that's why. So the trade between China and Rome was quite extensive. And the Romans were obviously paying in hard currency for the silk that they acquired. And that was regarded as quite a big drain on the Roman treasury. So they decided at some point under the Emperor Justinian that this was not the best idea. We don't want to import silk for hard currency. Why don't we produce it for ourselves? Now you hear that story over and over again. I mean, the whole mercantilist argument of the 17th century was all about, well, we want to trade, but we want to produce it. We want to produce as much of materials for ourselves, and only export rather than import. Anyway, under the Emperor Justinian, a plot was hatched to get hold of the raw materials to make silk. Now, at that time, in the 7th and 8th century, there's a group of monks called the Nestorian monks. The Nestorian church was deemed to be a heresy in the later stages of its development, because they had certain beliefs which didn't accord with what by then was the official church, the Catholic Church, and so they were branded as heretics. But what they did extensively was to travel. Nestorian monks ranged wide and large all over the Middle East and the Far East, and there have been records of their activities, usually obelisks or steles of one sort or another, saying, I, Marcus, the Nestorian monk, was here, or words to that effect. So they were traveling to China, where they actually established a church of their own, where they could practice whatever heresy they liked. It didn't matter out there. And the third great theft was when Justinian approached the Nestorian monks and said, can you get some of the makings of what we need to make silk and bring it back to Rome? And they did. They sent a mission out to China. They found out how the silk was produced, and they came back to Rome with silkworms and the mulberry seeds in the staves that they used to walk. The Chinese, as you can imagine, were very protective of their silk business. It was a lucrative business for them. They went to very great lengths to make sure that the secret was maintained in China. They obviously weren't very successful at it because of the monks, but death was the penalty for trying to take any of the ingredients out of China. And at that point, it was brought back to what was then Constantinople, And the silk industry was established around and about Constantinople. The seeds were bred into the mulberry bushes, the silkworms that they brought back were multiplied and bred, and the whole silk industry grew up in the Middle East. And it was refined enormously by the Jewish community. The Jewish community felt that this was a great opportunity for them because of the trading implications, obviously, and they went to great lengths to learn more of the secrets of sericulture and bring them back and refine the local industry. So we have a situation where the silk industry is now transported from China to the Middle East. Chinese, presumably mightily pissed off with this, but there's nothing they can do about it by this time. The next transfer was from the Middle East to Italy, and from Italy it went on to Spain. And the influence was not espionage of any sort. Of course, you've got the Moors involved in it by this time in the Middle East, and as the Moors expanded westwards, they took the secrets of silk manufacture with them, and they established a silk manufacturing industry, first of all in Italy and then subsequently in Spain. I said that the industry grew on the back of the demand from the upper classes. This handsome gentleman, I hope it's not an accurate picture, he would have needed to be an emperor to get away with that one. This Louis the 11th, Louis the 11th decided, along with many others, that he had to have a silk industry in France. So he nominated an area of France, which is now Lyon, and as an area where a silk industry could and should be based. Fortuitously, because the mulberry bush does not grow very far north in Europe, but it would grow close enough to Lyon for it to be the basis of a silk industry there. And so the silk industry in France, which was probably the premium silk industry of the whole of Europe for many centuries, was established under Louis XI. Francis I, there in his silk finery, developed the industry even further, and the mulberry bushes, you can see, were growing pretty largely in Provence, where the temperatures were good for their growth and where the bushes could obviously flourish. And it's not very far to transport them to Lyon. Just some examples of the sort of stuff that was being produced, really exotic dresses, and we'll see some more in a minute of the sort of stuff that was being produced. And one of the things that grew up was obviously the trade in silk from Lyon. And this became a very sophisticated activity. The traders based around Lyon developed these pattern books, and they used to travel all over Europe carrying their samples with them and showing exactly what could be done. Now, the pattern books were both an advantage and a problem because everybody could see what was available and they could copy them. And as a result of that, the silk industry just gradually moved north. Again, not necessarily espionage, but by a natural sort of progression, it moved north. Came to the attention of the British royal family. So here you have Richard II in his hooperlander. I don't know whether any of you ladies wear a hooperlander at any time. I had to look it up. It's a long-sleeved, shoulder-to-floor cloak worn mainly by royalty. And this one is supposedly in silk brocade. Henry VIII, another one in all his silk finery there, gloriously portrayed. I think that's a Holbein portrait of him. And the next great movement of the industry was the Huguenots. The Huguenots were a Protestant sect living in France. Yesterday I mentioned Cardinal Richelieu and his nest of spies in France. Cardinal Richelieu's big enemy was the Huguenots. And one of the reasons that he had his network of spies established was to root out the Huguenots and get them out of France by whatever means. He was behind a number of the battles that where the Huguenots who lived in the south of France for the main, around Toulouse and that sort of area. He was responsible for a number of episodes, and eventually with the various edicts at the time, the Huguenots were under such oppression that a large number of them decided to leave. And we talk about immigration into the UK at the moment as being a problem. Huguenots, 50 to 60,000 of them came within a very short space of time from France, mainly to London, set themselves up in Spitalfields, and you can see Brick Lane was a centre for Huguenot activities. They established their own church. And what did they bring with them? Silk. That was one of the Huguenot trades. And they established a silk weaving industry in Spitalfields in London, which became a major source of the product for British customers. Now, of course, we couldn't grow the mulberry tree. Nobody had tried, actually. They did try later on, it didn't work. But they had to import the raw silk from France. So the French weren't totally out of pocket as a result of this. They were selling skeins of silk for weaving in London. One of the developments that took place in England, because once we got our hands on it, we were quite interested in developing it, and watered silk was a product that was engineered in the British silk industry. Watered silk is produced by when the fabric is calendered, it's put between rollers. And as it's put between the rollers, you could just pick it out there on the dress. You could put that watering pattern in it. It's a little bit clearer on that one. John Badger was the development of that. And this became an intensely desirable product, not only in Britain, but also in France. So what happened at that time was that the French looked at this watered silk, and they actually sent a spy to London to pick up the secrets of how it was done. So watered silk gravitated back to France for production there too. So there's a certain amount of openness in the industry about moving things along. The patterns evolved, the fashions got more exotic. This is a silk waistcoat. You could probably imagine somebody wearing something like that today, to be perfectly honest. Famous paintings usually featured something in silk. This gentleman's silk waistcoat, which the dog is about to chew up, I'm sure to his great delight. The supply of silk in the UK was not enough to satisfy demand, but that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that it was incredibly expensive. The reason it was expensive was because there was a surtax on it. Like most luxury products, governments look at them from time to time and say, wow, that's a great way of making some money in tax revenue. And so there was a very, very heavy duty on silk if it's imported, and also a very heavy tax on it within the UK. So what happened was that the smugglers got into the act. And if you read any accounts of smugglers in the 17th, 18th century, you'll find that one of the products that they were most active in, apart from brandy, which is the popular one, not cigarettes in those days, of course, but silk was the other one. So smuggled silk became a huge business in its own right. This particular example was captured by the... there it is. This particular example was captured by the customs, and that mark on it there is the customs mark to say that this is seized by the customs. They weren't desperately successful on it with the captures because the smugglers were extraordinarily inventive. There were literally thousands of miles of coastline that they could bring products into, and you've all seen the stories of smugglers rowing ashore in the depth of the night and avoiding the customs officials. In Italy, the industry was also developing, and this is it exists. It's in a museum in Italy. What's called a throwing machine. Throwing, as I explained earlier on, is the process by which the silk is drawn together to make it stronger in multiple strands. That machine was produced in Lombardy and was incredibly successful, very efficient, and therefore very desirable technology. Now, here we have another real spy. This man, John Lom, and his brother were interested in making anything, but they chose silk as a desirable object. And John Lom went to work in the factory in Italy, in a throwing mill in Italy, and he worked there for several years. And while he was there, he copied the designs for the machine very, very carefully and stashed them away in his room. And eventually he left the company and returned to Britain, where he and his brother established a silk mill with using the latest technology. Unfortunately, it was suspected by the Italians that he'd done it. And rather than just approach him and say, "You shouldn't have done that, old chap," the report is that they sent a rather attractive Italian lady up to Britain who met him, and the following morning he was found dead. Now, he was either poisoned or he had one magnificent evening, I'm not sure which. But anyway, he ended up dead, and his brother took over the whole business, which is not the sort of retribution you expect for a bit of innocent spying by this time. The mill they established was in Derby. Part of it still survives. It's a representation of it in about 1728. Another one over the Derwent River. Part of it's there today. It's a museum in Derby. But those are some parts of the original buildings. One curious episode in the history of the silk industry in Britain was the Spitalfield riots. And again, this really goes back to a lot of what we see today. The workers, by this time, the silk workers, were being oppressed. They were being paid miserable wages, and eventually it got too much for them, and so they rioted. And they were quite significant riots. There was a lot of damage done and a lot of people injured and killed. Mills were established elsewhere, but by this time the silk industry was important, but of course Britain by then had a number of other things to do. By this time, the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution was gathering pace, and there was a very, very heavy emphasis on cotton textiles, on woolen textiles, and all the other big evolutions, the steam engine, the transport system, and so on, the steel industry, where technology was advancing incredibly quickly, and silk kind of fell into a backwater. It was a traditional industry, and so it wasn't at the forefront of people's thinking. I've forgotten why that's there. I'll be perfectly honest. I'm not going to make up a story about it. I've got my notes there, but I'm not using them. The industry, I mean, it was obviously significant, but eventually it fell into decline. And this is an old silk mill in Congleton in the middle of England, but it was abandoned and it was disused. There was an attempt, as I said earlier on, to introduce the mulberry tree into Britain. That particular tree survived, but the climatic conditions in England for growing the particular type of mulberry tree that the silkworms like would not grow there. So this is the only, well, I'm not sure that's the only example, but it's only that type of tree which grew, and not the one that the silkworms fancied. In parallel with developing the industry in Britain, we had a similar development in the US. It was taken over there. You can see the, come back. You can see very early days in the silk industry in America, where they did have the climatic conditions, as it happens, to grow mulberry bushes. And the silk industry was established. The biggest example of it is this company, the Cheney Brothers Mill in Manchester, Connecticut, which grew into an enormous production unit. They focused on fashion items for the American market, and including things like silk ties and whatever, cravats and so on. And that business survived into the 20th century quite successfully. There it is in 1920. In the late 19th century, there was another development which took place, which was really almost the death knell of the silk industry in Europe. The opening of the Suez Canal meant that transport between the Far East and Europe became much quicker, much faster, and also much cheaper. So the canal opened up the possibility for imports from the Far East, and of course one of the first things that was latched onto was the possibility of importing Chinese and Japanese silks. At the same time, there was a big problem with the silkworms in Europe. There was a silkworm disease which killed a whole load of them off. Again, another nail in the coffin of the silk industry in Europe. And so, once again, Chinese silks took the ascendancy. At that point, a man called Chardonnay, pronounced Chardonnay, but not spelt Chardonnay, invented a machine to produce artificial silk. And that machine, that's a patent drawing for it, if the silk industry hadn't been on its last legs at this time, that machine would have done it finally and utterly. The full circle is that the silk industry exists in Europe, in Italy. There's a lot of production up in the Lake District, the northern Lake District of Italy. Sorry, a lot of production. There is production. I remember going to Italy in the 50s and 60s, and one of the things you bought was scarves, ties, all made of the local silk in Italy. So the industry survives. But most of our silk now comes from, guess where? China. So the Chinese clearly play a long game. Don't underestimate them. Three centuries later, they're back in the market, and nearly all of our silk comes either from China or Japan. So there you go. That's a bit of a whirlwind tour of the silk industry. As I say, espionage played some key points in the transfer of technology. First of all, from China to Europe. Secondly, around Europe, and then within some of the key production points in Europe. It was an industry which was not exactly rife with espionage. Other industries were. The porcelain industry was a minefield of spies at a time, and as we'll see tomorrow and the days after, there are some other industries where it was even more prevalent than it is here. Okay, well, we're dead on time. If there are any questions, I'll be delighted to answer them. And as always, you can catch me outside and milk my knowledge of the silk industry. Or espionage, or anything else. Yes, sir, at the back there. The patent industry existed. The patent industry started, to the best of my knowledge, in the 18th century, certainly in the UK. A patent office was there. It was more or less coincidental with the Industrial Revolution, when inventors were making major advances. And patents were granted for, as today, for a limited period of time. And then after that limited period of time, the technology became available to everybody. James Watt was a great user. James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, was a great user of patents. And he managed to get Parliament to extend his patent on the steam engine from, I've forgotten how many years it was, whether it was 10, 15 or whatever years, which was the original patent. He got them to extend it for a further 10 or 15 years because his business depended entirely on being able to protect his patents on the steam engine. He didn't actually design the steam engine himself, that was somebody else, but he produced patents, patented products to make it work efficiently, and that's what he wanted to protect. So there certainly was a patent industry in Britain, and I'm pretty sure there was a patent industry in Europe as well. But quite clearly, a lot of this development took place before patents were that common. Was it that good? No questions? That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.